Now, first, let me thank the museum for sponsoring the traveling exhibit, because as those of you who've seen it, I think you see the very high quality from the Smithsonian, and very fortunate that the local museum has a chance to show that over the next number of months. And for those of you who haven't, I'm sure you'll take it in. Second, I do thank all of you for being here, showing your interest in hearing the story about the confinement of Japanese Americans in New Mexico, which, as I said before, is a supplement to the national incarceration. I show this. This is one of our poster images that we use. This is a painting by Jerry West, who's a local New Mexico artist, and it's a representation of the Santa Fe internment camp. So the title of the talk and the presentation today is Confinement in the Land of Enchantment, Japanese Americans in New Mexico during World War II. And you'll see that I frequently use the acronym CLOE, C-L-O-E. That's our unofficial project name. Very briefly, the project's purpose was to reach a wide and diverse audience in New Mexico and the United States about the histories of the Japanese American internment within our state. The main team members, and this is a project that's covered over 10 years of time. The main partners involved in this: Colorado State University, Central New Mexico Community College, the Mexico Japanese American Citizens League, many volunteers and other organizations that have helped us. And we've been funded principally by 3 grants by the National Park Service. They have a special grant program that supports these types of projects to document the history and to provide the education to the public on Japanese American internment across the country. The first phases of the project involved the installation of historic markers in Baca Camp, Camp Lordsburg, and Fort Stanton. And we put together an outreach publication, which I showed you the finished product. And then we also developed a website, a story map that's connected online for you to look at if you want to look at further information. Yeah, we still have a problem with the mic. I apologize. I'm not able to fix that myself. Most of you, and again, especially those of you who've seen the traveling exhibit across the lobby, know about the national incarceration, but let me give just a couple of minutes of background to provide a perspective. Obviously, a lot of this starts with December 7th, 1941, with the Pearl Harbor bombing. In March, the President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the War Department to, quote, prescribe military areas from which any and all persons may be excluded. This particular executive order started in motion the national activity to set up national incarceration sites across the country, and which ultimately held 120,000 Japanese Americans.
Oh my goodness.
those camps were run by the War Relocation Authority. So you saw previously that I noted that there was a ability to exclude certain people from certain areas. And so for the Japanese Americans, the line was drawn in dark there, from the Canadian border down to the Mexican border. Half of Washington, Oregon, all of California, part of Arizona. So all Japanese Americans who were in those areas had to be removed from those areas and generally were put into one of the 10 WRA camps. Tule Lake, Manzanar in California, Poston, Gila River in Arizona, Minidoka in Idaho, Topaz in Utah, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Granada, as we touched on, in Colorado, and 2 way over there in Arkansas, Brewer and Jerome. And again, as I've touched on before, those weren't all of the detention areas that were used by the U.S. government. And we'll talk about some of those others, like those here in Mexico. Very briefly, the War Relocation Authority was the government arm that ran the WRA camps, the Department of Justice, the Immigration and Naturalization Service ran Baca Camp, Santa Fe, and Fort Stanton camps. The War Department, the U.S. Army, ran the Camp Lordsburg site. So there were 4 sites in New Mexico. The Japanese Americans were defined as enemy aliens considered dangerous to national security. That was the motive for moving these folks into prisons in New Mexico. The Baca Camp, sometimes referred to as Old Raton Ranch, was in Lincoln County. Lordsburg was in Hidalgo County. Santa Fe, opposite Santa Fe County. Fort Stanton, also in Lincoln County. I just show those geographically on a state map. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on each of those sites, and I'm going to do it in chronological order in terms of the time frame of when they were opened up and operated from the beginning to the end of the war. And again, I'm covering a lot of details, so it's being done quickly, probably in about 30 minutes. So I apologize if I jump over a lot of things, but there's obviously quite a complicated story, quite a lot of detail. But I want to try to show you some of the main highlights of what we found and what we documented. And we will have a Q&A, so we can take your questions, and I'll try to answer them the best I can. So, oops, I'll go back here. So I'm going to start with Baca Camp, which held Clovis, New Mexico residents. Early, the Santa Fe had railroad workers from 1910 in Clovis. In 1941, just before the war, there were 32 Japanese Americans. Nikkei is a term that covers people of Japanese ancestry both those who are immigrants from Japan and those who are citizens. Some of those 32 were children who were born in the U.S., so they were U.S. citizens by birth. In January 1942, all of those were taken into custody, transported in government cars, and arrived at Fort Stanton, and moved to be held at an abandoned CCC site called Baca Camp, or Old Raton Ranch. The camp itself was about 14 acres, had 9 buildings. The government spent really no money to make those suitable for the prisoners that were held there. They spent their time there for about a year, and then they were moved out to one of the WRA or family camps. Most of these individuals went to either Topaz in Utah or one of the camps in Arizona. This is just a photo image showing a military parade in Clovis during the war. This is to help illustrate for those of you who are not familiar where Clovis is within the state, and the fact that they were transported from Clovis to Old Raton Ranch, going south toward Roswell and then going west to Old Raton Ranch in Lincoln County. Again, a photo image of the railroad workers in Clovis. This was taken in the 1920s. This is a drawing done by one of the prisoners of the Japanese American segregation camp of railroad workers in Clovis. You see the railroad tracks up at the top, and you see the individual family names of the structures that they might have lived in, and the other facilities like a little Buddhist church, and outhouse, and all the things that go with living in a particular setup. This is a photo of the CCC camp as it looked in the 1930s, so it gives you a feel for the type of location that the camp was situated in. Again, one of the prisoners drew a representation of the barracks that they lived in at Old Raton Ranch. It's another drawing by a camp prisoner, his perspective of the camp that they lived in. It's a view of the campsite today. Generally, all the structures are gone. The government sold off the site pretty much right after the war. There's few physical remnants of the camp itself. The site currently is managed by the U.S. Forest Service and the State Parks Department. The historic marker that we installed is on the dirt entrance to the camp itself, the entrance off of the main highway, the paved highway. One of the good notes to talk about in Clovis, in 2014, the city of Clovis formally apologized to the Japanese Americans for the bad deeds in World War II, and they named 3 of the prisoners who they brought back as grand marshals of their annual Pioneer Days Parade in 2014. The fellow waving is Roy Ibahara. Next to his left is Lily Kimura, and her brother, whose golf hat is just visible there, is Fred Kimura. So they were given a city's formal apology and were honored during the parade and other festivities during that year. Can most of you hear me okay? I apologize again, I'm soft-spoken, so usually a mic really is important for me, but I'll continue to try to do my best.
Are they going to try to do the mic?
Yeah, I think they're still working on it, so.
Do what you can.
Yeah.
Good.
That's why at least the PowerPoints actually have pretty much all the information that I'm talking about, and even more so. So that's the balancing act, is that the PowerPoint has that information. Lordsburg, second camp that I'll talk about. The plans and the construction began in January 1942. Oh, one of the things, because I looked at this so close, I missed the point, but to emphasize these dates, like in Clovis, January of 1942, January of 1942, and so forth, these were all actions done before the executive order was adopted by the president and before the activities happened on the national incarceration camps. So the U.S. government was already acting under their jurisdiction to start to round up and imprison Japanese Americans, even before executive order, which was in March of 1942. So like I said, the plans and construction started in January 1942, operated by the INS and the U.S. Army for mostly the duration of the war through January of 1945. The first portion of that, January of 1942 to November of 1943, it was used to hold Japanese Americans. After that point, those prisoners were actually moved to Santa Fe, that I'll touch on later. The site itself is about 6 miles east of town, a very large site, over 2,000 acres, over 280 buildings. As far as Japanese Americans, there were over 1,500 detained there, and they were taken from most of the coastal states, California, Oregon, Washington, also Alaska, Hawaii were included. An incident happened in January of 1942, where one of the guards killed 2 Japanese American prisoners. There was an attempt at a trial. The allegation was that they were trying to escape, but the guard was found not guilty. Again, like these other sites, the government sold off the property after the war, so there's very few remaining structures. There's a few above ground, there's a few underground structures, but pretty much, again, it's private property and with very few remnants of what happened during the war. This is a photo just to give you a feel of the lay of the land around Lordsburg. And most of you know, a lot of these sites were picked deliberately in desert-type areas that were not populated. This is a drawing by one of the prisoners of the camp. As I said before, this particular site was used for Japanese Americans until the fall of 1943. After that, it was used for holding Italian and German POWs. That's why the notation says POW at the bottom there. This is one of the drawings for the camp, and I included partly just so you can see how that was drawn up and then also to illustrate that clearly these were barbed wire camps. You see the barbed wire sign, and you see the GT is guard towers. So all of those are guard towers that were built at the camp. This is a group photo of some of the prisoners. These happen to be a group from Alaska. And you see these are generally older men. One of the things I want to point out is that the Japanese American prisoners were generally were picked up, only the men were picked up, and they were generally older because they were supposedly representing the community leaders who were potentially a threat to the American security. So you'll see older men. Here's a prisoner's drawing of his barracks at Lordsburg. Here's a ground sculpture that was built by the prisoners, and they picked the U.S. Eagle to demonstrate their patriotism to the United States. Again, it's like I said before, the property is now private property, so this piece of work is actually deteriorating. It doesn't look as good as it does here, and it will continue to deteriorate because there's no protection currently provided security-wise. The prisoners did publish a Japanese daily newspaper. There were many, many letters written by the prisoners back to their families. This is one example written in Japanese. The Mexico Japanese American Citizens League provided a number of volunteers to translate certain portions of the Japanese material to English, including a number of the letters. This particular letter, Mr. Hanazawa is writing to his family in Hawaii. This is a photo showing the area where the prisoners were shot. One of the remaining buildings that the owner has converted to a residence from what used to be the hospital. The next site, Santa Fe, which is the largest. Probably most of you know the most about Santa Fe. If you know anything about the sites, you probably have heard about Santa Fe. Again, in February 1942, the activities started to set up the site. The INS acquired property from the Mexico State prisons of about 80 acres. It's an abandoned CCC site built in the 1930s, 1.5 miles center from the town of Santa Fe. Took a couple months to convert to house 1,400. The Japanese American prisoners started to arrive in March. It was deactivated for a short time in late 1942. It was expanded and reactivated in February 1943 to hold 2,000 prisoners. And the camp operated till the summer of 1946. And you might wonder, why was it operating after the war was over? As we understand it, Santa Fe was one of those facilities that was kept open to use to process out prisoners, because obviously, even though the war was over and the government had said that the prisoners were free, they weren't just pushed out the door. There had to be paperwork, and they had to be documented as they were released. And Santa Fe served as one of those processing sites for a number of the confinement sites across the country. Let me spend a few sentences on Dr. Ben Tanaka as an illustration of one of the prisoners' stories and his experience. He was a practicing medical doctor in Portland, Oregon. He was Penofate camp. So he heard stories from his father about life there at the camp, and then later on in his artistic career, Jerry West decided to do this painting. The original of this painting has been donated, and it's in the possession of the New Mexico Museum of Art. Drawing of the camp by one of the prisoners. This is a group shot of prisoners held at Santa Fe from Oregon. As I touched on before, there were some prisoners from Latin America who were held in U.S. internment camps. The man there, he was held in Santa Fe. This is a picture of the family together before that episode, and this was taken in Lima, Peru. This is a watercolor painting done by one of the prisoners. To me, it's one of the more poignant ones because it's a very nice watercolor painting. It's looking from the inside perspective out through the barbed wire and taking in the nice hills around Santa Fe, outside of the camp. There was, like I touched on before, the prisoners did poetry, they did woodwork and arts and crafts, including stone and wood sculptures. These are some illustrations of those works. As an overview perspective of the camp, here's two photos, the 1950s and 2015. The one on the left shows the camp in the center of the photo. Again, like the other sites, the property was sold off by the government to a private developer who turned it into Casa Solana residential development that you see on the right side. And again, as you would imagine, pretty much all the remnants of the camp were removed or destroyed. For those of you who are familiar with Santa Fe, the main highway to the very right is 284, 285, heading north. And the historic marker that was put there at the camp was put at Frank Ortiz Park, which is up in the upper left corner. So the marker is not at the camp, but it overlooks the site of the camp. Okay, the fourth site, Fort Stanton. Probably a lot of you know the Fort Stanton historical site. It's existing, long time history, built in 1855, had many uses. The Japanese American prisoners were from Tule Lake and the Santa Fe camps, and a very small number, about less than 20, and they were put into these segregation facilities in early 1945. These individuals were generally defined as agitators and protesters within the camps. They were pro-Japan. And they were allowed to depart at the end of the war. In fact, some of them who wanted to go back to Japan were allowed to go back. These photos are just to give you a reminder, a feel for Fort Stanton. This is existing buildings that were used for officers. The next couple are overviews of the Fort Stanton site, which is also quite large. Looking to the right is north, this way, and Juanito Rio is the creek there, and the Japanese American camp was at the very right of the creek. these victory huts are examples of the housing that were used for the Japanese Americans who were held at Fort Stanton. The current view of the campsite, again, everything was removed, so it's bare ground. The historic marker that we have at Fort Stanton is located right in that area. I want to remind you again that, as I said before, that almost all of those who were confined in Mexico were brought in from outside the state. The only exception are those CLOE residents. So for those Japanese Americans who were living in New Mexico when the war broke out, well, actually, they first arrived into New Mexico as coal miners, farm workers, or railroad workers. In the 1900 to the 1950 time frame, that number was really just a few hundred. It was mixed treatment toward the Japanese Americans in New Mexico, from negative, as you heard about in Clovis, to positive in Gallup. I'll mention a couple positive stories. Actually, I've already covered Hershey Miramura, so I won't repeat that, but he and the Gallup story is one of those positive stories about treatment of Japanese Americans by New Mexicans. The second I'll mention briefly is Roy Nakayama. His family grew up in Las Cruces. He, after the war, got his PhD in agricultural sciences at New Mexico State University. He worked for the agricultural research facility there, and he was one of the very top developers of hybrids to New Mexico chili. So most of you probably enjoy New Mexico chili. If you enjoy Big Jim, he came up with Big Jim. I want to show that, I'll say, a number of Japanese Americans did serve in the U.S. military to show their loyalty to their home country. I won't discuss this anymore unless there are questions. Remembering the New Mexico confinement sites, I'll mention one topic here, was the activity to establish a historic marker in Santa Fe, near the Santa Fe camp. This was started by historian Tomas Chavez, and it took from 1999 to 2002 to accomplish that. But the marker was approved and was installed in the location that I told you about. And for some reason, that not as bold as the others, but again, as a reminder, the CLOE project involved historic markers installations at Fort Stanton, Lordsburg, and Baca Camp. The outreach publication was prepared that I held up for you, and copies were distributed to all the schools in New Mexico, to the libraries, and to museums and other interested institutions. The project website was developed, and as I said before, it's accessible online. The most recent full phase of the CLOE project involved developing a traveling exhibit of the material. Well, that's going to bring me to the end pretty soon. It's perfect timing. And holding community presentations. And we did that in Lordsburg at the Hidalgo County Museum, at Fort Stanton Historic Site, and at the Santa Fe Public Library, the Southside Branch. My official role in this last phase, I was the volunteer project director of the last phase. That might be it.
You have to close the box.
Yeah, there's probably only one more important one that I want to show. And that's as far as future activities, one of the major activities that we have planned in the near future is the Santa Fe Internment Camp and its historic marker 20th anniversary event, which is scheduled for April of 2022. That's 20 years after the marker was first installed. And we've titled the event Stories, Memories, and Legacies. The program will be held at the New Mexico History Museum, and after that, the pilgrimage to the marker at the Frank Ortiz Park. The co-sponsors are the New Mexico History Museum and the New Mexico JCL. We have flyers, if you want to take those, so that remind you of that particular date. If you want to support, please put that on your calendar, and we'll have more information as we get closer, but that's one of our next major events, is to commemorate the 20th anniversary of that particular marker. These are just some of the knitting materials that we put together to support the CLOE project, one of which I mentioned before, the prisoner roster. And that's it, so take questions. Thanks for your patience in terms of the technical challenges, but hopefully you got most of it, and I'll try to deal with your questions. Go ahead.
I noticed that there was a president from South America, or Peru.
Yes.
So, they're going down the entire coast of all that South America. And President Japanese.
Yes, yeah, Japanese ancestry. The understanding, and I'm a volunteer, so I don't have all the historical credentials, but from what I understand from talking to other CLOE members who got the historical background, is that apparently the U.S. government logic there was that they wanted to have a pool of potential exchange prisoners. If they had in the future had to exchange with another country, then they had a pool of prisoners within their jurisdiction. And yeah, to answer the first part of your question, yeah, the individuals were of Japanese ancestry who were living in Latin America, who were citizens of Latin American countries.
Could I add to that? Ultimately, they ended up, the families at Crystal City, Texas?
Again, it's very, very complicated because, and it goes beyond my knowledge, but a lot of those prisoners were brought into Texas because obviously it's a seaport, and some of them ended up going through like El Paso and then ending up in camps in New Mexico. But I think as you're touching on, I think a number of them ended up in Crystal City and other places. The other unfortunate activity that we've heard about, and some of the other team members be able to comment on, is that when the war was over, these prisoners were released, but then they were people without a country because they had been taken from their home country, brought to the U.S., not necessarily in legitimate reasons, and they did not have U.S. citizenship, so they were people who did not have a country. And some of them are still fighting for proper recognition of that and reparations. So that's another subset of a sad story.
Follow up on that gentleman's question. The prisoners taken from South America, did this include, there's a rather sizable Japanese diaspora in Brazil. Did it include some people from there?
I don't know, I believe so, but your point is well taken. Peru and Brazil had a Japanese Latin American population, so there was numbers there that could be tapped into as prisoners. Yeah.
I may have mentioned this earlier, but prior to the executive order, what the authority to, was there some central authorities to round up people and put them into camp?
Yeah, I'm not maybe the best qualified to answer that. I think my layperson's understanding is that the federal government, including the FBI and others, use the power to define people who are potentially a threat to the national security under the general existing authorities at that point in time, and then use that authority to pick up the prisoners before executive order in March of 1940.
Emergency war power.
Yeah, because obviously the U.S. was at war, and well, you probably know better than I do in terms of how certain powers can be carried out under emergency or under presidential jurisdiction. So, but like I said before, if you didn't realize it, the pickup of these prisoners started December 7th, 1941. One of our team members, his father was picked up on December 7th, 1941. So that's, you can easily surmise, and our historians say so, that the U.S. government already had a list of potential quote threats before Pearl Harbor, and then they started to use that when they decided to deal with what they considered a national threat to the security from the nations.
I have a question on the historic markers. You mentioned briefly about Santa Fe marker and how many years it took to actually have that marker recognized. There are also 3 other markers. What was the paper trail and what was involved in getting those markers?
Yeah, again, good questions, and they lead to more discussion. The book that we sell does have a section on the development and installation of the Santa Fe marker. I'll try to give you a short answer and then also answer your second part of your question. There was opposition initially to the Santa Fe marker. If I can summarize it correctly, part of the difficulty was that there was confusion by those in the community, and probably initially rightly so. And most all of you know, obviously, of the bad history of the Baton March and the bad things that the Japanese soldiers did there. So that's history. And a number of the people, the soldiers and the military in the community, thought that this marker was a way to honor, Japanese, and somehow honoring those that did some bad deeds, at the Baton March. And so part of the discussion that had to go on was, we're talking about 2 sets of populations: those Japanese Americans that were held in internment camp in Santa Fe, and then separately those that were responsible for the Baton March. And ultimately, as I understand it, that was worked out. It was still a very close vote by the city council, but that's why it took a number of years to go through that issue. And I think there was also a separate commemoration additionally for the Baton March survivors to recognize that there were 2 different things, and obviously there should be a notation on both activities. The 3 other markers, the CLOE project identified those were worthy of having historic markers, and those were designed and installed under the CLOE project. So that was funded by the National Park Service grant.
How do you feel about there's debate about terminology between internment and concentration camp, and I was wondering how you feel about the difference in those terms and the connotation.
Yeah, and again, I'll be answering this as more of a layperson, but it's a very good question, and historians and academics have dealt with and are still dealing with that subject. And you're asking, and other people who have discussions, that comes up in everyday conversation as probably a worthy set of discussions. My answer to that is that, and again, the original designers of this project had to deal with that. What terminology were they going to use? And exactly went through the thought process that you're touching on. I think the use of very quick answer. The US government initially did use the term concentration camps for these internment camps for Japanese Americans. For whatever reason, they did use that terminology. And I think it was in the generic term, you're concentrating people into a certain area and putting them into a camp. Later on, obviously, we know the unfortunate meaning of that with the Holocaust and so forth. I think most powers to be have decided that's not the right term because the Holocaust and the concentration camps really were significant and meant something, and to get into that confusion is not appropriate. So then they looked for other terms. Internment was used, incarceration, confinement, and again, I won't belabor the point, but our project, people picked on confinement because it's a broader term. Definitely the prisoners were confined. In the Baca Camp case, it was not a barbed wire, but they were confined. They couldn't leave that site because there was a government control force there to say you've got to stay there for the duration. So that's the best answer I can give now. But for our case, that's why we use confinement as the broader term. Confinement, imprisonment, they were imprisoned by government action. I'll stop there. I'll be available later on. One of your board members has an additional discussion point.
Yeah, real quick, sorry about that. I'm Robert Singer. I'm director and general counsel to the museum. We would first of all want to thank Victor for this wonderful presentation and for all of you to be here. It's a very important event. It's a very important historical event. It's one of the worst things America has ever done to its citizens, and it's having reverberations even to the present time, as you pointed out. I just wanted to make a kind of a quick point of information for whatever it's worth. In a few weeks, we'll have the 80th anniversary of the attack of Pearl Harbor, so this is a very timely time to be thinking about this and reflecting about the importance of this event in history. In my real life, I'm an entertainment attorney, and one of the projects we've been working on is a motion picture that we'll hopefully get complete funding for and start producing next spring, which is 80 years basically from the time that this really happened, including the whole focus of the internment camps around the country. There was, in our research for this, we just stumbled across it, but we came up with a number of very compelling documents that show that there was one community in the United States that stood up against this, and they refused to let the Army come in and take their citizens. And that one community was Gallup, New Mexico. Percy Miyamura, who you've talked about, who is probably one of the most decorated soldiers in history of Asian American descent, won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his exploits in Korea. And that's a movie in itself, some of the amazing things Hershey did. But Hershey is a central character in the movie that we're getting ready to produce, which will be called Gallup. And we've already done a novel that would be based on that would be marketed with the movie, hopefully to make some money. And if it does make some money, we'd like to certainly donate some to the causes like CLOE, which is really educating people about this kind of thing and about the dangers of these reactions that people of the government or whoever have to war and things like that, that really hurt innocent people without the necessary constitutional safeguards being honored and recognized. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and we're going to use New Mexicans as many as we can in the telling of the story in the movie, and hopefully it'll be a timely kind of thing to educate people who really don't know about what really happened back in 1941-42 that cause us to rethink our commitments to right and wrong and constitutional and legal principles that we can sometimes forget in the heat of the moment. So thank you, Victor, for sharing that with us, and thank you all for being here.